Good morning. Welcome to our service today. I'm Scott Finley, and I'll be your service coordinator on this beautiful, though cloudy, May morning. We're so glad to have Reverend Dr. Michelle Peterson with us today to share her message, Is There Another Story Other Than the One I've Always Told? Jesse is our Zoom host today. Karen is co-hosting, and Sandy created another beautiful chalice display at GNUUC. The contact info on your screen show you the best ways to get in touch with folks with answers. Texting or calling Reverend Cynthia at 859-221-3034, or reaching out to our admin, Chris, at gnuuc@gnuuc.org. As Sandy lights our chalice this morning, here's a reading from Reverend Scott Taylor. We gather as a house of stories as we learn of those who have gone before. The way in front of us becomes more clear. As we weave together the tales of who we are, our loneliness lessens and the web of our oneness is revealed. As we listen deeply in those times of tender trust, we descend into the longings and learnings, hopes and fears of the humanity we share. Beneath the wells from which we drink, there is a deeper well that feeds them all. Come, let us tell each other tales of our thirst. Let us drink from the stories that sustain us all.
My life goes on in endless song above earth's lamentation. I hear the real, the far off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear the music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? What though the tempest round me roars? I know the truth it liveth. What though the darkness round me close? Songs in the night it giveth. No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to the rock I'm clinging. Since love prevails in heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing? When tyrants tremble as they hear the bells of freedom ringing, when friends rejoice both far and near, how can I keep from singing? To prison cell and dungeon vile, our thoughts to them are winging. When friends by shame are undefiled, how can I keep from singing?
Please join me in reading our covenant. We covenant together to make a welcoming community, to walk together in the way of truth and love, to seek the life of the Spirit as it is known by each person, to support each other in thought, word, and deed, as we work to build a better world. For Time for All Sages today, we have a short video from Jason Silva talking about truths found in science and truths found in poetry and stories. Here's Jason Silva.
How does a camera lens capture truth? We're all interested in truth, right? I'm talking not about a mathematical proof, nor a physics account of the universe, nor the rules that govern biology or DNA. This is all, of course, crucially important, but it is not the subject of this reflection. I am talking actually more about the truth that sets us free. What Eric Davis calls poetic truth, or the realm of poetic facts. Early humans sat around the campfire and told stories. Storytelling, it is said, helps us structure and pattern the mind. We can't think about our own thinking without some kind of autobiographical storytelling that contextualizes us as free agents operating in the world. And so we use stories, we use myths to understand ourselves, to gain insight into ourselves. And yet, in empirical terms, myths are fictions. How to reconcile then the fact that something like a myth, like a story, can be fiction from the outside, but true from the inside. True in that its lessons are real, its lessons are valuable, its lessons have something objectively important to teach us about ourselves and about the world, right? And thus, they are useful fiction. They are truthful fictions. It's uncanny how this works, the paradoxicality of storytelling, right? You've heard the line that says sometimes fiction is more truthful than reality. We rely upon novelists to conjure up worlds from their imagination, to exteriorize their flights of fancy, to construct, to concoct worlds of fiction, manufactured realities, within which, of course, we can find great truth. This extends as well to cinema, to all forms of art. Cinema is truth 24 times per second, 24 frames per second of truth in the movies. Right? Art is the lie that reveals the truth. This is fascinating to me. You know, Alain de Botton as well, he says poetry, right? Subjective truth may be less accurate than journalism in describing the details of an event, but may nevertheless reveal truths beyond the literal grid. So the truth of myth, the truth of music, the truth of fiction, the truth of poetry is beyond naive realism. And this is fascinating to me because to account for the human experience, one must account for both sides, right? For science and art, for empirical truth and poetic truth. And Ursula Le Guin tried to reconcile these worlds in her famous idiom, her famous quote, that science describes accurately from the outside, but that poetry describes accurately from the inside. That science, that objectivity explicates, but that poetry implicates. Both celebrate what they describe. Or that line in Dead Poets Society when Robin Williams tells us, of course, that science, engineering, mathematics, these are noble pursuits necessary to sustain life. But poetry, love, fiction, art, these are the things we stay alive for. And being a aspiring artist and a truth lover and a light chaser, I need to find ways of intermediating, right? Mathematical truth, objective truth with the truth that sets us free. So at the risk of repeating myself, let us together in concert reaffirm that something can be false from the outside, but true from the inside. That there is utility in truthful fiction. That art can be the lie that reveals the truth. And that without music, life would be a mistake. This, my friends, is what I believe. This fuels the work that I do, the content that I make, the songs that I sing, the tightrope that I walk, the line I toe between chaos and order, the flow I find between discipline and surrender. This is how we find our way. This is how all contradictions are reconciled, and this is how we surpass the gods. Yes. Cheers.
We're doing a special collection this month in lieu of our normal Share the Plate program. Nathaniel Reveal would like to say a few words about this collection. Good morning, Nat.
Good morning, friends. Hi. So, at the suggestion of the social action team, the congregation, at the suggestion of the social action team and the minister and the board kind of agreeing, this month's Share the Plate program will in fact support the minister's discretionary fund. Interestingly, our normal Christmas service is when we would do this. The entire collection at Christmas would go to the minister's discretionary fund, but this was not a typical Christmas, and so we are kind of revisiting that through this new process. So here we are. What is the minister's discretionary fund? So the minister's discretionary fund allows the minister to make targeted short-term emergency grants to help with the basics of living: food, shelter, utilities, medical costs, for purposes that are aligned with the congregational mission. And so in this particular case, the Share the Plate for May will be going towards the minister's discretionary fund, and the funds that we raise during May will be used to help the one-time transition costs associated with housing for our Ukrainian friend who's staying in the congregational building now, but will be leaving to a permanent apartment round about May 20th. And there are some kind of one-off costs associated with moving into an apartment for the first time. And that's how we're going to be helping. So friends, if we could go to the next slide. Great. The congregation has two ways that you can contribute to the minister's discretionary fund. You can go to gnuuc.org/pledge. Click the donate button at gnuuc.org, and that will bring up a form, and one of the form options there for where you'd like your contribution to go will be the minister's discretionary fund. If you're already pledging by text, then you can simply text an amount and the letters MDF for minister's discretionary fund, and then the finance back-end folks will make sure that money gets where it needs to go. So thank you all for your generosity in the month of May and support of work that's aligned with our mission, and moving this person who is temporarily without a home because of their sexual orientation into a home for the long term. Thanks much, friends. Back to you, Scott.
Thank you, Nat. Today's reading is a poem written by Laura Hershey. In it, she tells us what can happen when telling our own stories. What you risk telling your story, you will bore them. Your voice will break. Your ink spill and stain your coat. No one will understand. Their eyes become fences. You will park yourself forever on the outside your differentness once and for all revealed, dangerous. The names you give to yourself will become epithets. Your happiness will be called bravery, denial. Your sadness will justify their pity. Your fear will magnify their fears. Everything you say will prove something about their God or their economic system. Your feelings that change day to day, kaleidoscopic, will freeze in place, brand you forever, justify anything they decide to do with you. Those with power can afford to tell their story or not. Those without power risk everything to tell their story and must. Someone, somewhere will hear your story and decide to fight, to live and refuse compromise. Someone else will tell her own story, risking everything. And now I'd like to introduce Reverend Dr. Michelle Peterson. Many of you already know her, but for those who don't yet, Reverend Michelle is a community minister affiliated with our very own GNUUC and is a spiritual director in private practice. She received training from Hezekiah School of Spiritual Direction at the Redemptorist Renewal Center in Tucson, Arizona, and a Master of Divinity degree from Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago. Previously, she earned a doctorate in sociology from Loyola University, Chicago in 2006. More information about Reverend Michelle and her ministry can be found at spiritspacenashville.com. Reverend Michelle, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. And it tickled me that Scott was able to say the name of the school properly. It's a tricky one. So I'm glad to be with you all this morning. Years ago, when I was asked, if your life were a children's book, what book would it be? One of my favorite books from childhood came easily to mind, The Little Engine That Could. What I remembered was that the train was having a hard time getting up a mountain. As it chugged along, it kept telling itself, I think I can, I think I can. And eventually it did. And that was the way I lived my life. I kept trying and trying until I would make it, get whatever it was I set out to do done. As a child, this story spoke to me on many levels, and it combined so many of my loves. It was a book with words and pictures, and it was about mountains and trains. It can't get much better than that. Preparing for this morning, I watched a YouTube reading of that book. Wow, there was so much more going on than I readily remembered. In this story, the train was carrying gifts to children on the other side of the mountain when it broke down. The toys implored other train engines to assist them. But the larger engines refused. And then a little engine came along and agreed to try to help. While I was listening to this YouTube reading, I recalled how upset I was as a child that the other engines wouldn't help. And then my relief when the little engine pulled the train to the other side of the mountain. As an adult, I hear this book differently than I did as a child. I know that trains and toys aren't animate. And through experience, I also know that no matter how much I want something, no matter how much I chant, I think I can, that some things aren't possible. While the story may not be factual, it is nonetheless true. There are times when I will be refused assistance. There are those that will help. And those with the least power are the most likely to assist. Story is all around us. It shapes who we are, how we navigate the world, what we understand about ourselves, and how we perceive others around us. We are shaped by the multitudes of stories, both formal and informal. Our personal stories, family, cultural, creation stories, all are present and interacting, creating new stories. We are shaped not only by those that are told, but also those stories that are not told. We are at all times story creator, teller, and consumer. Story is fundamental to our lives. As children, our learning often begins with listening to stories that teach us how to do things. Some were taught to tie their shoes with the story of the rabbit running around the tree and going down the hole. As soon as children become vocal, they become storytellers. 4-year-olds tell excellent tales, quietly explaining the world around them to their toys and to anyone else that will listen. Stories shape our identity. The spoken and unspoken shape our familial and cultural history. Growing up, I received little information about my family history. I was told that I was ethnically diverse and that one of my great-grandfathers was French and another great-grandfather was Native. As a young adult, I learned that my maternal great-grandfather's parents were from Switzerland and Germany. So I believed that I was primarily French, Native, and German. Ancestry DNA confirmed most of that, except that I don't have any French ancestry. That French great-grandfather was actually German. At the time of his immigration around 1914, French immigrants were more welcomed than German immigrants, and so he passed as French. What stories, if any, have you been told about where you come from? History is shaped and reshaped by what is included, what is excluded, and whose story is told, prioritized, valued, and privileged. The early followers of Jesus of Nazareth shared tales with their family and friends about what they had seen and heard. Those stories were told and retold over and over within particular communities. And each community had their own set of accounts of the events. It was more than 50 years afterward that any of those tales began to be written down. I wonder how much changed in the retellings. When I was about 8 years old, we played a game in school called Telephone. In this game, the teacher told the first student a story that was then passed student to student throughout the class, telephone style. The final student would say aloud what they heard, and that final telling was never anything like the original story. It's not just kids who change the story, though, through telling. Think about the last company you worked in, or your extended family, how the telling of something changes person to person. Codifying stories may help with the retelling, but whose story gets written? The accounts of Jesus's teachings differed community to community. The early church leaders, men, decided that a consistent narrative was needed. A small group got together and decided which stories were proper and included those in the Bible, while others they deemed improper were then excluded, and forbidden. This became Christian history. Those grand narratives about how the world operates impact us in innumerable ways, sometimes harmful ways. I know that each of you can name several harmful grand narratives, ones that many of us are actively attempting to dismantle. A common story can pull communities together or tear them apart. We consume and participate in the creation of story. As author Diane Millis puts it, we are both narrator and creator, narrator and character in our own story. Hundreds of years ago, the only way to share information was when someone walked into town. As new modes of transportation, the carriage, train, automobile, airplanes, and then communication, postal mail, printing press, telegraph, telephone, internet, developed, the speed of story increased. Now we know about things happening on the other side of the world as they are happening. In this digital world in which telling and retelling occurs quickly, it is more important than ever to pay attention to who gets to shape the story. My ministry as a spiritual director is to listen to the stories of people, to companion them as they search for meaning within the story of their lives. Directees share how they have been affected by the narratives of others and by their own stories. Those we tell ourselves may not be as far-reaching as the grand narratives, yet they are no less damaging. These personal narratives can be quite harmful and insidious. We are shaped not only by the stories told to us, we are shaped by the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and about who other people are. For example, the narrative I tell myself about whether I'm a good person or a bad person, the story I tell myself about what I should or shouldn't be doing. These stories often keep us from being our full, authentic selves. We might tell ourselves, I can't do that because I am too old, too young, too short, too tall, too big, too small, too something to do that. Or we might harbor the story that there is too much to do, that we can't possibly enjoy life or take time for self-care. Far too often, the running narrative within ourselves is highly self-critical. There are, of course, exceptions, times when I'm engaged in story that I've been wronged, or that nobody understands, or that I am alone. These stories we tell ourselves are not nurturing or compassionate, and instead close us off from others. And out of those stories, anger and resentment emerge. Similarly, there's stories I tell myself about other people, which other people are good, which other people are bad, what they should or shouldn't be doing. These are the stories of implicit bias, the stories that we unconsciously participate and perpetuate, most often around race. I don't need to elaborate much here. Examples of these stories abound in social media. It is not just them that participate in the creation of the stories about others, the other political party, the other part of the country, the other religion. All of us participate in the creation and telling. Some are more overt than others. These stories are rarely compassionate, connecting, or healing. We are shaped by the stories that we share about ourselves with others and those that we don't share with anyone. Likely, when introduced to someone, something about us is told, a short story is shared. Naturally, this introduction doesn't include everything about us. Over time, as we get to know and trust the person, we share more of our personal story. There are things that we leave out of our stories, parts that few people know about. This is what the sociologist Irving Goffman terms impression management, the process of managing the perception that others have of us. There may be something that we don't want others to know about, or something that's embarrassing that we leave out of our narration. For example, when I was a kid, I was in a bowling league that met every Saturday morning. I enjoyed bowling, and I even won a trophy for my average. One year, the league I was on went to state championships. The part I might leave out was that when I got up to bowl, I swung my arm back and dropped the ball behind me. I was so embarrassed. One choice I can make is to leave that part out of my telling. However, that part might be exactly what another needs to hear, that this embarrassing thing happened to me, and I made it through okay. Sharing our stories with others, being open to listening to others, is where healing begins. Great care must be taken in when, where, how, and with whom we share. Not everyone can be trusted with our story. Reverend Nadia Boltz-Weber has a podcast called The Confessional, where people share something from their lives in which they feel guilt, shame, or regret. The confessors don't believe that they can share the story with others in their lives. Holding on to the stories makes them fester and grow in intensity. The podcast allows them to share their secret with a compassionate person. Sharing stories takes some power away from the secret. That's really the essence of 12-step recovery programs, sharing our experience, strength, and hope with each other. The entire second half of the book, Alcoholics Anonymous, is filled with stories from recovering alcoholics, describing what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. They illustrate how life has changed as a result of working the program. Through sharing, we are released from fear and shame, and in sharing, we offer hope to others. Compassionately listening to another's story opens your heart and opens the possibility of connection. Hearts and minds of people are changed through sharing, through empathy, not through shaming and blaming, either shaming and blaming yourself or others. Last week, we watched the movie Philomena on Netflix. This movie is an excellent example of multiple competing stories and the transformative power of connection. Each character brought their own story to the situation. Philomena's story, the convent's story, the son's, the story the journalist wants to tell, and the one the newspaper editor wants to tell. At first, Philomena believed the narrative that she was a sinner and that God was punishing her through her suffering. She was ashamed and did not want others to know what happened. The journalist, however, was angry about what happened to her and wanted others to be punished. Ultimately, Philomena forgave herself and forgave others for their decisions. after which she decided to tell her story. In the telling, she was released from her own shame, and through telling what happened to her, the gaps were filled in for others in their own lives. And those responsible for harm could be held accountable. Her compassion was healing for herself and for others. We are shaped by our own stories and by those of others around us. Story is not static. It is ever changing and moving. At all times, we are author and listener in a fluid dance. Once brought out into the open and compassionately examined, narratives can be changed. Ask yourself, what is the story I am telling myself about me? Is there another I could tell other than the one I always tell myself? We do not have to hold tightly to the same narrative. As healing occurs, the story will change. At one point, your story might have been one of victim. Later, as things unfold, it might be one of survivor. One day, that experience may be a tiny blip on a much larger and grander life story. The Little Engine That Could is a tale of compassion and connection, illustrating that we need one another to make it to the other side of the mountain. The smallest engine didn't believe the narrative that she was too small. She told herself, I think I can, and she did. May we be compassionate listeners to ourselves and to others. May we share our own stories. May we offer hope. I think we can. Amen.
Thank you, Reverend Michelle, for that wonderful message. It's fascinating to think about how the power that how a story can change and the power within it. Now on to our next hymn, Building a New Way.
We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, growing stronger every day. We are building a new way. We are working to be free. We are working to be free. We are working to be free of hate and greed and tyranny. We are working to be free. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our prize. Without these, our world will die. Peace and freedom is our cry.
We'll be turning off our YouTube live stream now as we enter the sacred time of sharing joys and concerns. Thank you for